The call came in at 2:14. I was in the coordinator's office at the back end of the station's emergency relief wing, catching 3 hours of sleep on the cot I kept behind the filing cabinet, when the intercom above the door clicked twice and then went to Marin's voice. She was the night watch dispatcher, and she had a quality of stillness in a crisis that I had always respected. The kind of stillness that is not the absence of feeling but the product of long practice, the discipline of a person who has learned that calm in the delivery of bad news makes the news more bearable and nothing else does. Coord Dale, Medical Bay, inbound transport Kethvarath Sovereign 7 reporting hull breach and personnel injuries, ETA 11 minutes. Station physician requesting coordinator presence. I was on my feet before she finished the sentence, not because coordinator presence at a medical emergency was unusual. It wasn't. My role at Kethamil 3 was to stand between the station's general medical resources and whatever the diplomatic transit wing threw at us, which was occasionally routine and occasionally not. I was on my feet because I had been doing this work for 15 years before I took the coordinator posting and another 9 after, and I knew the particular weight that Marin's voice carried when the situation was more than it looked. I pulled on my jacket, checked the supply status display on the wall out of habit, not because I expected a problem, but because checking it had become the same kind of reflex as breathing, the thing you do automatically so that when it matters you have already done it. Then I went. The medical bay at Kethamil 3 was a good facility. That is worth saying plainly, because what happened in it that night was not the fault of the equipment or the layout or the training level of the staff who had been rostered on. The station physician was Dr. Velthar Ossel, not the Velsorn species, despite the title format, but a name his family had carried from the outer margin settlements for 3 generations. 12 years in practice, certified for 3 species groups, competent and careful and thoroughly unsuited for what walked through the bay doors at 2:25. His 2 duty nurses were competent as well. The problem was not competence. The problem was that Velsorn vascular anatomy had not been in any of their training, and Velsorn vascular anatomy was what was about to require them. I knew this because when I arrived at the bay 4 minutes before the transport docked, which gave me time to pull the patient manifest off the incoming feed and read it, I saw Ossel at a data terminal in the corner with the look of a man who was learning something large and unfamiliar very fast and was not certain he had enough time. He was scrolling. The scroll was rapid and did not seem to be producing reassurance. "What do we have?" I said. "Sovereign 7 is a Velsorn diplomatic courier." He did not look up from the screen. Queen Regnant of the Kethvarath sovereignty is aboard with a full diplomatic escort. Hull breach caused a shrapnel penetration event in the main passenger compartment approximately 12 minutes ago. The ship's emergency system deployed a bioseal compound over the entry wound, its standard Velsorn emergency protocol, an automated response to detected vascular compromise, but the seal is partial. The compound is degrading at the lower margin. He finally looked at me. "We have a Velsorn primary vascular wound presenting under a partially effective seal, Coord Dale. And I have never treated Velsorn physiology in practice." Database. There is an entry in the species emergency reference. I've read it twice. He said this in the tone of a man reporting on a problem that reading has not solved. Their circulatory system is not analogous. The major vessels run along different axes. Their blood equivalent, the circulatory fluid, does not respond to standard manual pressure protocols the way human or Setharon or Velkoreth physiology does. There are species-specific stabilization protocols, but they require device application to specific vascular points that I cannot locate from the database entry alone without significant risk of error. Specialist. Medical Consul Tailsorn at Threshketh Station. I queued the connection 8 minutes ago. He glanced at the comm panel on the wall behind his terminal. He estimates live comm in 40 minutes, transit video in 20. He cannot be physically present for 3 hours. 3 hours is a very long time when a wound is open. I have been in enough situations where 3 hours was a very long time to know that 3 hours is measured differently when someone is bleeding than when someone is not. I did not say this aloud. I said, "All right," which is what I say when I understand the situation and am determining what to do about it, and I went to look at the equipment manifest on the bay's secondary display while I determined it. I had been a field trauma medic before I became a coordinator. 15 years on the outer margin emergency relief circuit. The kind of work that takes you to frontier stations and transport casualties and crashed survey vessels in locations where the nearest specialist is 3 hours away as a matter of unremarkable routine. I had treated species I had no training for, using anatomy references pulled up on a handheld display while the patient bled and I worked, and the two things happened at the same time because they had to. I had made decisions with incomplete information in rooms where the person who knew the most correct thing was still me by default, because everyone else in the room knew less, and the patient needed the most correct person available, not the most qualified person unavailable. I did not like those rooms, but I knew how to work in them. The knowing is not a comfortable thing to carry. It comes from the specific kind of experience that leaves marks, but it is useful in the way that a tool is useful, which is to say that it becomes the thing you reach for when the other things are not present. The transport docked hard, a gravity-assist landing that shook the bay floor a fraction, not unusual, but the impact of an emergency approach rather than a routine one, which told me the transport pilot was landing fast and was right to do so. Then the doors opened. There were 7 people in the Keth Varath escort party, and they came through the door fast and in formation, which is what a protective escort does when its principal is injured and frightened, and has been trained since childhood not to be either of those things visibly. The principal was in the center of the formation, walking under her own power, and I would learn later that this was deliberate, that she had told her escort captain she would walk through the bay doors herself or they would wait in the corridor, because she was the queen regnant of the Keth Varath sovereignty, and she would not be carried through a door. But in the moment what I saw was a woman holding herself very carefully upright in the specific way that tells a field medic the effort is significant. There is a quality to that kind of uprightness. It is not the natural uprightness of a healthy body. It is the maintained uprightness of a body that is doing 2 things at once, functioning and managing the fact that it is damaged, and the maintenance costs something with each step. She was in her late 30s. That was the first thing I noted clinically, because age affects recovery curves and I was in a clinical frame of mind. Amber bronze skin, the specific warm depth of coloring that I recognized from the Velsorn species reference I had pulled up on my handheld in the corridor on my way to the bay. I had read 4 paragraphs of Velsorn physiology basics in the 3 minutes it took me to walk from the coordinator's office, which is not a sufficient medical education, but is the kind of preparation that is better than no preparation. Dark hair, close cropped. She was dressed in what had been formal diplomatic attire, and was now a torn and biosealed version of it. The left side of the garment cut away where the emergency team on the transport had accessed the wound, and the bioseal compound on her left side was the pale copper yellow of Velsorn emergency foam, which I had also just read about. The gray-violet of her eyes was visible even across the room because she was scanning the space when she entered, the way a person in authority always does when they enter an unfamiliar room, taking inventory, measuring, calculating what they have been brought into and whether the people in it are the kind of people who can manage the situation. I would come to recognize that quality of measurement as specifically hers, something she did with the same automatic thoroughness that I checked supply displays. She was doing it even now, in pain and managing it, because she had been doing it long enough that the habit did not stop for circumstances. The escort captain came through the formation first. He was broad, in well-worn formal protective armor, and he got to Ossel before Ossel could get to his patient. Physician. The escort captain's standard compact was fluent and formal. Her sovereignty requires the standard well-worn primary vascular protocol. The bioseal compound was applied at 203 and is holding at partial integrity, specifically at the lower margin of the penetration site. You will stabilize the compound and maintain field stasis until the Sovereign 1 medical team can be dispatched from Keth Vareth Prime. Ossel opened his mouth, closed it, the particular expression of a man who has been given an instruction he cannot follow and is calculating the least damaging way to say so. Captain, I have to advise you that my training does not include well-worn vascular. The protocol is standard. The captain's voice did not change register or pace. It will be found in your species' medical emergency database under well-worn emergency classifications, Section 12. I am aware of the database entry. Ossel's voice had the particular quality of a person trying to be precise under pressure. What I am telling you is that the database entry for well-worn emergency vascular stabilization requires a familiarity with well-worn vascular topography that I do not have. The device protocol references anatomical landmarks I cannot reliably identify on a living patient without prior species-specific training. The risk of misapplication is. There are no other options at this station. There is a specialist on comm in approximately 35 minutes who can. 35 minutes is unacceptable. The captain's voice had not changed, but something behind it had. He was a professional doing his job, and his job was to put his principal in the hands of someone who could help her, and the person currently standing in front of him was telling him he could not do that. I require you to act. I stopped listening to the argument because I was watching the patient. She had been guided to the primary exam surface by 2 of the escort members, and she had sat on it correctly, efficiently, with that same maintained uprightness. But her hand had gone flat to the surface beside her hip for a fraction of a second before she lifted it away. That is what a person does when they need to steady themselves and are determined not to be seen doing it. I had seen it 100 times in field work, on patients who were trained to project competence and stability and could not quite maintain the projection when the body insisted on making itself known. The body always insists. The only question is how long you can defer the insistence. The bioseal on her left side was copper yellow and approximately 12 centimeters across at its visible edge. The foam was intact at the upper margins and visibly weeping at the lower left, a thread of fluid, darker than the copper yellow of the compound itself, which was what well-worn circulatory fluid looked like when it was oxidizing at a wound margin, darker than human blood, more viscous in its visible quality. The thread was thin, but it was there, and thin threads at wound margins do not stay thin threads. The argument behind me had developed 2 new participants. Both duty nurses were now involved, and the escort captain had produced a data device and was showing Ossel a text on the screen that Ossel could not read because it was in the well-worn administrative script, which is a syllabic writing system not taught in any standard medical training curriculum. I walked to the supply cabinet. I knew what I was going to do. I had known it, I think, from the moment I'd seen her hand go to the surface and lift away, that particular quick steadying gesture that the patient is always the last to know they've made. The knowing was not dramatic, and it was not certain in the way that a verified medical decision is certain. It was the same quality of knowing that tells you after 15 years of field work that the valve is going to fail before the instruments confirm it, or that the patient is more serious than they're presenting. You act on it because the alternative is to wait for certainty that is not coming, and the patient does not have time for you to wait. The supply cabinet at Kethamil 3 was well stocked. I had seen to this personally when I took the posting 9 years ago. I had gone through every drawer and replaced 3 years of unexamined inventory with current specification materials, cross-checked against the station's diplomatic traffic patterns, and the species groups that transited Kethamyl 3 most frequently. I had added a Velsorn species emergency kit to drawer 7 because Kethamyl 3 had regular Class 2 Velsorn diplomatic traffic, and it was simply the correct thing to do. Not because I expected to use it, because the difference between a preparedness gap and a preparedness standard is not the probability of need. It is the cost of the gap when the need arrives. The kit had been sitting in drawer 7, unopened for 9 months. I pulled it out. It was compact, the Velsorn emergency kit standard format, a flat case the size of 2 outstretched hands, gray-green housing with the Velsorn medical marking in copper on the face. It contained, among several other components, a Velsorn vascular field stabilizer. The device was approximately the size of my palm, designed to work by reading the bioelectric signature of Velsorn vasculature through the wound site and applying targeted microcompression to the vessel walls nearest the penetration point, reducing circulatory flow at the wound without requiring the operator to manually locate specific anatomical structures. The principle was analogous to human field pressure devices. The application was species-specific and different in its implementation. The instructions were printed in 4 languages on a fold-out insert, one of which was standard compact. I read the instructions while I walked to the exam surface. The fold-out was dense. I read quickly when it matters, and I have always read quickly when it matters because field work requires it, and I absorbed what I needed in 42 seconds, which was long enough to walk from the cabinet to the surface with 2 steps to spare. Coord Dale, Ossel's voice from behind me and to the left. Give me a moment. There is an active protocol disagreement. I know, I have the kit. I reached the exam surface and set the kit on the tray beside it. She was watching me. She had been watching me, I realized, since I'd gone to the supply cabinet, not with the unfocused quality of someone in shock, and not with the wary quality of someone uncertain about what was approaching. She was watching me with the specific, measuring quality of a person who has spent years determining the competence of others quickly, and has just acquired new data and is processing it. The gray-violet of her eyes was steady and clear, and there was something in them that was not quite pain and not quite fear, and was, I thought, the expression of a person who had been in rooms where the outcome depended on other people before, and who had learned to read those people very fast because the reading was often consequential. I'm Orrin Dale, I said, Compact Emergency Relief Coordinator. I'm going to examine the wound site. She looked at me for a half-second that was not hesitation but assessment. Then she said, proceed. Her voice was even. She was in pain. I could see it in the tension across the right side of her jaw, which was the side she was not consciously monitoring, and in the very controlled quality of her breathing, which was the kind of breathing that becomes deliberate when the body is managing a significant insult, and the mind is keeping the management from showing. Controlled breathing at that specific pace means the pain is present and being managed rather than absent. I examined the wound. The BioSeal compound had been applied correctly, as far as I could tell from the insert reference. The Velsorn emergency application instructions were clear about the sequence, and the transport medical system had followed them. The upper and right margins of the seal were solid, the compound well integrated with the wound edges. The lower left was the problem. The shrapnel had created a penetration at an oblique angle, entering from the lower left and traveling upward and inward, and the emergency foam, which deployed radially from the application point, had not achieved full coverage at the deepest extent of the oblique penetration. There was a gap 2 millimeters at its widest, perhaps a fraction more at the wound base, where the foam edge had not made complete contact with the wound margin, and that gap was the source of the thread of fluid I had seen. 2 millimeters of unsealed Velsorn vascular wound, with the compound degrading at that margin, would not remain 2 millimeters for 3 hours. I activated the Velsorn vascular field stabilizer. The device emitted a low-frequency hum as its scan initiated, not a sound that would be audible outside the immediate area, but present enough that I could feel it slightly through my palm as I held it. The display on its face showed the initialization sequence running, then the scan output. A vascular map, not a diagram I would have recognized from any prior training, but a functional one. The relevant structures identified by the device's own internal reference system, and the compression protocol calculated automatically against the scan data. It took 11 seconds for the scan to complete. Behind me, the escort captain said something in Velsorn. I could not interpret the words. The tone required no interpretation. Velthardine. Her voice was quiet and entirely absolute, the way a single word can be when the person speaking it has spent years making certain that single words carry the necessary weight. One word, his name, the Velsorn address form that conveys expectation without elaboration. The captain went silent. I applied the stabilizer to the lower margin of the wound. She did not make a sound. I knew it cost her something, because the device manual had noted dryly, in the cautionary section, that Velsorn vascular compression applied to exposed wound tissue rather than through a complete foam buffer produced a significant tactile sensation that most patients found difficult to manage. The gap in the seal meant the compression was working on exposed tissue at the deepest wound margin. She held perfectly still, her breathing maintained at the same controlled pace, and I kept my hand steady, and the thread of fluid at the lower margin slowed over approximately 40 seconds and then stopped. "The compression is holding," I said. "Yes," she said, "not a question. I'm going to reinforce the seal compound over the gap. There's a secondary applicator in the kit precision format for exactly this situation. It will take 2 to 3 minutes. "Then proceed," she said. The secondary applicator was smaller than the emergency foam housing, designed for precision repair of partial seals rather than initial wound coverage, and it integrated with the existing compound rather than overlapping it. I applied it to the gap in 2 passes. The insert specified 2 passes for oblique penetration geometry, and the compound sealed. The display on the stabilizer confirmed the integration. The vascular activity at the wound margins was stabilizing, the bioelectric signatures normalizing as the compression protocol completed its work, the pressure differential at the wound base resolving toward within the device's acceptable range. 14 minutes from the moment I opened drawer 7 to the moment I set the stabilizer down. The room had been loud when I crossed it to the supply cabinet. It was not loud now. The escort captain was standing approximately 2 meters behind me, very still. The 2 escort members who had guided her to the surface were also still. Dr. Ossel was at his data terminal in the corner, and I could see from the angle of his shoulders that he had been watching the stabilizer display from across the room rather than looking at the communication panel. The 2 duty nurses were standing near the supply tray with the particular stillness of people who have been watching something happen and are still absorbing that it happened. She was looking at me. "The immediate bleed is controlled," I said. "The compound integration will require a follow-up application in 90 minutes. The device will flag the window. I'd recommend Dr. Ossel manage the follow-up once medical console Tailsorn is on live comm. The console can walk him through the secondary protocol directly with the scan data from this device to reference." I set the stabilizer on the tray beside the kit. There is no substitute for a Velsorn specialist review before you resume transit. The initial stabilization is solid, but the wound is recent, and the compound is still integrating. She held my gaze for a moment after I finished speaking. The measurement quality in her eyes had changed, not absent, still present, but the character of it was different. The earlier quality had been the rapid assessment of a person deciding in emergency conditions whether the incoming factor was reliable. This quality was something else. Something more deliberate. "You are a coordinator," she said. "Yes." "Not a physician." "Field trauma medic, retired from active circuit work 9 years ago." I glanced at the stabilizer. "The treatment log is recorded in the device. Dr. Ossel will have the full transcript for the medical record." She looked at the stabilizer on the tray. Then she looked back at me. "You had a Velsorn emergency kit in your supply cabinet," she said. "Kethamil 3 has regular Class 2 Velsorn diplomatic traffic. It seemed the correct preparedness standard." The gray-violet eyes held something now that they had not held when she walked through the doors. Something that was not exactly warmth and not exactly surprise, but was in the direction of both, recalibrated through the filter of a person who does not allow themselves surprise easily. "Velthar Dean," she said to the escort captain, "please coordinate with the station physician regarding the follow-up protocol. The compact medical consultant should have the device transcript shortly." A pause, brief but deliberate. "I would like a few minutes." The captain's expression did what it did. He looked at me with the professional evaluating quality of someone whose job is to determine threats, held the look for 3 seconds, and then gave a short nod and moved toward Ossel's terminal. The escort members followed his lead. The nurses went to the supply management station near the east wall. The room organized itself around her request, with the quiet efficiency of people who understood what a few minutes meant when she said it. I stood at the end of the exam surface and did not sit and did not leave, which was the correct reading of the situation. "You did not wait to be asked," she said. "No." The physician was uncertain. The captain was providing instructions. There was significant discussion. "Yes." "You went to the supply cabinet." "I did." She considered this. Not the way a person considers something they don't understand, but the way a person considers something that does not fit the category they had prepared for it to fit. "Why?" she said. A direct question. It deserved a direct answer. "Because the instruments were there," I said. "And you needed someone to use them." She held that for a moment. Outside in the corridor, a station maintenance cycle clicked on and off. One of the ventilation adjustments the station ran automatically every 20 minutes to manage the atmospheric mix in the medical wing, a sound I had stopped hearing after the first month of the posting. "That is the most accurate summary of the situation I have heard this evening," she said. There wasn't anything useful to add to that. "You will rest now," she said, and it was the Velsorn sovereign address form for a conversation concluded well. The particular phrasing that is both permission and instruction, that closes the immediate matter and leaves the next one open. "I am told the follow-up application will be in approximately 90 minutes. "I'll be available," I said. "I did not say available," she looked at me directly. "I said you will rest." I considered the situation. "Yes," I said. Something shifted almost imperceptibly in her expression. She had expected, I thought, a different kind of answer. The 90-minute follow-up went without incident. Medical Consul Tailsorn was on live comm by the time the stabilizer flagged the window, his image clear enough on the bay comm panel that I could read his expressions while he reviewed the treatment transcript. He had the particular quality of a specialist encountering competent emergency work done outside the standard credentialing framework, a combination of approval and professional assessment that he kept carefully neutral while he directed Ossel through the secondary application. I managed the instruments and held the stabilizer while Ossel applied the secondary compound under Tailsorn's guidance, and the integration completed cleanly at 4:31. The consul reviewed the final output, confirmed the primary vascular response was within normal parameters for a wound of that severity and age, and gave transit clearance pending a recheck at 1400. At 4:37, she was moved to the diplomatic rest suite on the station's upper level by 2 escort members, walking under her own power, slower than she had been at 2:25 but steadier. I went back to the coordinator's office. I did not sleep. The cot was where I had left it, and the 3 hours I had been planning to finish were still technically available. But the quality of the room had changed in the way that rooms change when something significant has happened in them, and you have come back to them afterward. I sat at the desk instead and reviewed the treatment log, cross-referencing the stabilizer output data against the Velsorn vascular emergency reference section by section, checking my own work the way I had always checked my own work in field medicine, not because I expected to find errors, but because the check is the discipline, and the discipline is what makes the work reliable. I found 2 points where my application had been at the margins of the device's recommended pressure parameters, both at the lower wound edge during the initial compression. Within range. Adequate. Not the work I would have produced with a week of device training beforehand, but the work that the situation had required, and that the situation had been able to produce. I wrote the incident report, complete, detailed, referenced against the Velsorn emergency protocol insert at every relevant point, with the stabilizer transcript appended as a supporting document. I filed it with the station medical record and copied it to Tailsorn's office with a note indicating the copy was submitted for species case review. I updated the Drawer 7 inventory to flag the used materials for requisition replacement, and submitted the supply request before 600, because the correct time to restock a used emergency kit is immediately. Then I went to the morning brief. It was routine. It was a transit station. Routine is what most of it is. I sat in the brief and listened to the operational updates and answered 2 questions about facility scheduling and thought about the Velsorn vascular field stabilizer. At 9:40, Marin came to the door. The Queen Regnant's escort has been asking for your schedule. What for? Captain Velthar Dean would like to know when you are available for a coordination debrief regarding the 2:25 incident. Marin's expression acknowledged what a coordination debrief was and was not. Tell him I'm available now if the captain is, I said. What arrived at my office at 10:15 was not the captain but a junior escort member, polite, formal, with the correct Velsorn greeting phrase delivered in careful standard compact, carrying a document on the heavy cream paper with the Keth Vareth housemark embossed at the corner. He handed it to me, delivered a request in accented standard for me to present myself at the diplomatic rest suite at 1100, and left. I read the document. It was, as far as I could determine from the standard Velsorn administrative format, a formal personal request for a meeting with the Queen Regnant. Not an order. The kind of request that has the weight of an order but is not one, because the person issuing it has chosen to make it optional. I thought about this for a moment. Then I went to find a better jacket. The diplomatic rest suite at Kethamil 3 was the best of the 3 the station maintained, which meant it had real windows with a view of the outer corridor transit lane and furniture that was neutral-toned enough to suggest neither the station's aesthetic nor the visitors. There was a sitting room where the meeting was held, not large, but with enough space that the room did not feel like it was organizing itself around either of us. She was standing at the window when I was shown in. She had changed from the damaged diplomatic attire into a Velsorn traveling robe in a deep gray-green that suited her coloring, and her left arm was in a light support wrap, correct practice for the compound integration period, as the device manual had noted. She turned when I entered, and I saw that the quality of her movement was better than it had been at 2:25, which was the expected outcome of a successfully stabilized wound over a period of several hours, and also a thing I was aware of with more relief than was strictly clinical. Dale, she said. Velsorn Vithai, I said. A brief pause, barely a beat, and then something in her expression adjusted, not dramatically. It was the particular small recalibration of a person who has received something that does not fit their expectation of how this conversation was going to begin. The form of address I had used was the standard Velsorn personal form, name first, house designation held, which the species relations reference described as appropriate for direct informal address between two people who have worked together in a crisis situation. I had read this at 5:47 and had decided that the correct choice was probably the direct one, because indirect choices in situations like this one tend to produce the kind of stiffness that makes honest conversations harder. "Please sit," she said. I sat. She remained at the window a moment, looking out at the transit lane, where a compact logistics transport was making a slow approach to docking, and then came to the chair across from me, moving with the careful deliberateness of a person managing their body's recent history. She sat. "I have been doing diplomatic transit for 11 years, she said. In 11 years, I have had occasion to use the services of 4 different station medical bays. I waited. None of them, she said, had a Velsorn emergency kit in their primary supply inventory. It is a gap in standard preparedness for stations with Class 2 or higher Velsorn transit traffic, I said. I noted it in my first-month facility review. The kit is not expensive, and the storage footprint is minimal. You noted it, and you corrected it. Yes. She looked at me with the measuring quality, the same quality she had used in the medical bay, and before that when she came through the doors. But this version was not the rapid emergency assessment, and was not the sovereign evaluation that had come after it. It was something more considered. The quality of a person who has been thinking about a situation and has reached a conclusion and is now looking at the situation directly to see whether the conclusion holds. You understand that what you did last night was not within your formal scope of practice as a coordinator, she said. That's correct. You acted outside your scope. Yes. Without being asked. Yes. In a treatment situation involving a Velsorn primary vascular wound that your station physician considered beyond his capacity. He was right to consider it beyond his capacity, I said. The device managed the anatomical difficulty. That is what it is designed for. She considered this. Outside the window, the logistics transport had completed its approach and was in the docking sequence, its hull filling the lower half of the window frame and then rising past it as it settled. Why, she said again. The same question. This time it was asking something different. Not the operational why of an emergency assessment, but the other kind. The one that lives underneath operational questions when the immediate crisis is resolved, and there is time to look at what actually happened. The instruments were available and the situation required them, I said. There was no correct reason not to act. That is not how most people reason, she said. I spent 15 years as a field medic on the outer margin circuit. In field work, the reasons not to act are almost always worse than the situation you are acting into. You develop a reflex toward the situation. I considered how to say the next part accurately. It is not courage. It is the product of long familiarity with what happens when you don't. She held that for a moment. The light through the window had shifted as the dock transport's hull blocked and then released it, and the sitting room was briefly dimmer and then lighter again. I owe you a formal designation under Velsorn Sovereign Protocol, she said. I knew what she meant. I had read about it in the Species Relations reference at 547, in the section on formal sovereign recognition categories, for non-citizens who had performed significant service to the Keth Vareth principal line. You don't owe me a designation, I said. She looked at me steadily. Dale. I did my job, I said. or near enough to it that the distinction is not worth discussing. You did more than your job. I did what the situation required of the resources available. The situation happened to require more than my formal job description. That is what situations do. I met her gaze. A formal designation for following a preparedness standard and using an emergency kit that was already in the drawer seems to me to be more than the situation warrants. The situation, she said carefully, warranted you. I did not immediately have an answer for that. She let the pause hold for a moment, and then she said, "Vel thar sorn." It was the first time I had heard the word spoken, though I had read it in the species relations reference between the incident report and the morning brief. In the academic literature, it translated variously as the one who held the watch, or the one who remained at the post, a Velsorn phrase from the early settling period, when the boundaries of young sovereignties were maintained by posted sentinels who stayed at their positions regardless of what approached, because the boundary did not hold itself and someone had to hold it. The phrase had entered Velsorn formal recognition language as a designation for someone who remained steady when the situation called for anything but steadiness. I understood, with the kind of understanding that is not verbal and does not arrive through reasoning but through something more direct, why she had chosen that word rather than any of the formal designation categories I had read about. "I don't require a designation," I said. "No," she agreed, "you don't." A pause that held both the acknowledgement and something else. "That is why it is Veltharsorn and not any of the other categories." I looked at her. She held the word in the space between us, and then she did something I had not expected. She let it rest there without requiring me to receive it formally, without asking me to accept or decline or perform anything. She named it and let it be what it was, a thing she had said, that was true, that had been spoken and moved on. "I will be resuming transit to Kethvareth Prime at 1600, she said, "pending Consul Tailsorn's clearance at 1400. The station will receive the standard diplomatic transit acknowledgement." A pause. "There will also be a supplementary notation to the Kethamil 3 facility file, from my personal record." "That's not." Coord Dale. The quiet absolute quality was back in her voice, the single word carrying the weight she placed in it. "You will allow me this." I looked at her. She looked at me. The window behind her showed the transit lane and the slow movement of a distant courier against the corridor's gray. "Yes," I said. Something relaxed in her expression, just slightly, just enough to see if you were watching for it. She had been, I thought, prepared for more resistance. The willingness to let her have the notation had landed differently than she expected. "The emergency kit in drawer 7, she said. "It will be restocked." I submitted the requisition at 5:35 this morning. She looked at me. "Of course you did," she said. There was a quality in those 4 words that was not quite dry and not quite warm. It was the quality of a person encountering something that confirms a conclusion they have reached and finding that the confirmation is not a surprise precisely, but is something they are aware of in a way they had not quite anticipated being. Neither of us said anything for a moment. "The Velsorn medical literature on compound integration recommends light movement during the consolidation period," I said. "Not restricted movement. Ambulatory movement, walking. It supports circulatory normalization around the wound site." She looked at me. "Is that a clinical recommendation, Coord Dale?" "It is what the literature says." I looked at the window. The corridor on this level has a clear stretch of floor, 42 meters between the suite and the secondary observation point at the far end. No supply rotation until 1300. "I do not typically take walks in station corridors before diplomatic transit reviews," she said. "No," I said. "It would be unusual." "Yes." She considered the window. The courier that had been in the transit lane was past it now, and the corridor beyond was empty and lit and longer than 42 meters in both directions. "Will you walk with me toward Dale?" she said. It was not quite a question. In the species relations reference, it was described as the Velsorn personal address form for an invitation between people who had worked together in a crisis and were now, in the aftermath, determining the nature of the thing they had been doing. I had spent 9 years being a station coordinator, and 15 years before that being a field medic, and some years before that becoming the kind of person who becomes those things. And I had spent all of those years developing the reflex toward situations rather than away from them, which is not a comfortable reflex to have, but is the one I had, and which was telling me now that this was a situation. "Yes," I said. We walked the corridor. 42 meters, lit by the overhead panels and by the indirect daylight equivalent that the station's outer-level windows brought in from the transit lane. She set the pace, which was slower than her natural pace would have been and faster than it would have been 2 hours earlier, and I matched it without adjusting ostentatiously, which is what you do when someone is managing their own recovery and does not want the management pointed at. We walked in silence for the first 20 meters. Then she asked me a question about the station's emergency supply classification system, specific enough to be a real question, not a conversational gesture, and I gave her a specific answer, and the answer led to a follow-up question about the preparedness gap I had flagged in the first-month facility review, and I explained the gap and what I had done about it, and she asked about the process for implementing facility standard updates at transit stations in general, which is a question that required a real answer of some length. And by the time we turned at the far end of the corridor, we had been talking for 14 minutes and had covered the compact diplomatic transit facility preparedness framework in more detail than I had covered it with anyone since the review meeting 3 years ago. She was, I learned in those 14 minutes, the kind of person who asks operational questions because she is actually interested in the operational answers, not performing interest, actually thinking about what the answers mean and what they imply. The questions she asked were the questions of someone who was mapping a system as she heard about it, identifying gaps and leverage points and implications. We turned at the far end and walked back. "The notation I am submitting to the facility file," she said, somewhere in the middle of the return. "It will recommend the preparedness standard you described be adopted across Class 2 and higher transit stations. That recommendation would need to go through the Compact Facility Standards review process," I said. "I am aware of the process," she said. "I have made recommendations through it before." A pause. "They have not always been adopted." "No," I said, "they're not always adopted. This one should be." I thought about this. About the 9 months the kit had been in drawer 7, and the 11 seconds the stabilizer had taken to map a wound, and the 14 minutes it had taken to stop the bleeding that would have become something else in 3 hours. "Yes," I said. "It should be." We finished the corridor in silence. At the suite door she stopped and I stopped. 1400, she said. "I'll have the facility coordination summary for the consul's clearance review ready by then," I said. "Yes," she looked at me, "you will." She went inside. The door closed with the particular sound of a well-fitted door, solid and precise. I stood in the corridor for a moment. Then I went back to the coordinator's office to write the facility coordination summary. At 1400, Consul Tailsorn's clearance came through. He reviewed the treatment transcript and the wound status update and confirmed the compound integration was complete and stable, and he gave transit clearance with a recommendation for a follow-up review at Keth-Vareth Prime within 18 hours of arrival. Ossel handled the clearance documentation. I handled the station coordination requirements for the 1600 departure. At 1600, the Keth-Vareth Sovereign 7 lifted from the docking bay. Clean departure rating. Transit cleared. I watched the departure on the bay status display because I happened to be in the bay for a separate coordination matter, and because it seemed like the correct thing to do. At 1610, the standard diplomatic transit acknowledgement arrived from the Kethvareth sovereignty, formal and correctly formatted, noting the station's services and providing the relevant transit record identifiers. At 1612, the supplementary notation arrived. 3 sentences in Velsorn administrative script and 1 in standard compact, and the standard compact sentence was the one that belonged in the facility record. The station coordinator demonstrated competency and preparedness beyond standard posting requirements in a species medical emergency situation. The facility's emergency supply protocols and species-specific inventory reflect serious and commendable practice. This notation is submitted for the permanent facility record of Compact Diplomatic Transit Station Kethamil 3. Below the formal notation, in a different hand, direct, not administrative, the kind of writing a person does when they are not writing for a record but for a specific reader, there was 1 sentence in standard compact. Veltharsorn, the watch is noted. I read it twice. Then I filed it in the facility record where it belonged and went to check on the supply requisition for drawer 7. The replacement kit arrived the following Tuesday. I logged it, confirmed the specifications, put it in the drawer, updated the inventory record, and submitted a facility preparedness note to the Compact Transit Station Standards Review, recommending that all Class 2 and higher Velsorn diplomatic transit stations maintain a Velsorn species emergency kit in their primary medical bay, with the 214 incident at Kethamil 3 as the supporting case basis. The note was adopted as a facility standard recommendation 6 weeks later. I received a notification when it was adopted. I read the notification. I filed it. Then I sat at the desk in the coordinator's office, on the same cot I had been sleeping on at 2:14 when Marin's voice came through the intercom, and I thought about the specific weight of those 4 words in the second handwriting at the bottom of a formal diplomatic notation. The watch is noted. I had been a field medic and then a coordinator for 24 years. In 24 years of working in rooms where the most correct answer available was still me by default, I had learned that the significant moments rarely look the way you expect significance to look. They do not arrive with the weight you assign to them in retrospect when you are assigning it. They arrive as an instrument in a drawer and a woman's hand going to a surface and lifting away, and the quality of certainty that produces the reflex toward a situation rather than away from it. Why? She had asked it twice. The first time in a medical bay at 2:25 with the operational meaning, what caused you to act? The second time in a sitting room at 1100 with the other meaning, who are you that this is what you do? I had answered both times as honestly as I knew how to. The instruments were available and the situation required them. The reasons not to act are almost always worse than the situation you are acting into. These are true things. They are the true things from which field medicine and station coordination are made, and I believe them the way I believe in supply requisitions and incident reports and the discipline of checking your own work. But I am aware, sitting at the desk in the coordinator's office with the facility standard adoption notification filed and the supplementary notation in the facility record where it belongs, that there is something underneath those true things that I did not say in either answer and have not written in any document. Something that is not the operational truth or the professional truth but the other kind, the kind that lives in the category that does not have a form or a number. She was in pain and she was holding herself upright and she was measuring everyone in the room to determine whether any of them would be adequate to the situation. Her hand went to the surface and lifted away. The thread of fluid at the wound margin was thin and getting thinner. The instruments were in drawer 7. I am a person who has spent 24 years developing a reflex towards situations rather than away from them, and I am aware that the reflex does not explain everything about what I did at 2:25. The reflex explains the going to the cabinet. It does not explain the specific quality of what I noticed when she sat on the surface and held herself upright and lifted her hand away, which was not a clinical observation and was not a preparedness standard and was not anything that belongs in a facility record. It was, I think, the awareness of being in a room with someone who was managing something significant and being one of the people in the room who could help, and that being enough reason to act. Velthar Sorn. The watch is noted. That, I think, is the accurate account of it. I have not needed to add anything to that sentence since.